your host, Ivy Poeasy. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 4 of Black Bolshevik, an organization of revolutionaries, where we'll get into Harry Haywood's experiences with various organizations. Chapter 4, an organization of revolutionaries. Otto was pleased when I first told him of my desire to join the party in the summer of 1922. He said that he had known that I had been ready to join for some time, but he suggested that I should wait a while before joining. When I asked why, he told me about an unpleasant situation which had arisen in the party's South Side branch. Most of the few black members were concentrated in this English-speaking branch, but it seemed that a number of recent black recruits had dropped out. They resented the paternalistic attitude displayed toward them by some of the white comrades, who, Otto said, treated blacks like children and only seemed to think that the whites had all the answers. It was only a temporary situation, he had assured me, the matter that had been taken up before the party district committee. If it was not resolved there, they would take it to the central committee. And what if it doesn't get satisfaction there? I queried. Well then, there's the Communist International, he replied emphatically. It's as much as our party as it is theirs. I was properly impressed by his sincerity, and by the idea that we could appeal our case to the Supreme Court of the International Communism, which included such luminaires as the great Lenin. The blacks who had remained in the party had decided not to bring any new members into the branch until the matter was satisfactorily settled. I was rather surprised to hear of all of this. Clearly, the membership of the party did not automatically free whites from white supremacist ideas, nor for the matter did it free blacks from the distrust of whites. Throughout my lifetime, I'd found that interracial solidarity, even in the Communist Party, required a continuous ideological struggle. Otto suggested that until the matter was cleared up, I should join the African Blood Brotherhood. The ABB were a secret all-black revolutionary organization to which some of the black party members belonged, including Otto. I later learned that the matter of white paternalism was eventually resolved to the satisfaction of the black comrades. I don't recall the details. I think that Arne Swabek, the district organizer, or Robert Miner from the Central Committee, finally came down and lectured the branch on the evils of race prejudice and threatened disciplinary actions to the point of expulsion of comrades guilty of bringing bourgeois social attitudes into the party. In the meantime, I took Otto's advice and joined the African Blood Brotherhood. He took me to see Edward Doughty, the commander of the Brotherhood's Chicago post. Vouched for by Otto and Doughty, I was taken to a meeting of its membership committee and went through an induction ceremonies. This consisted of an African fraternalization ritual requiring the mixing of blood between the applicant and one of the regular members. The organization took its name from this ritual. Doughty performed the ceremony. He pricked our middle fingers with a needle. I hoped it was sterilized, which then, when drops of blood appeared, he rubbed them together. Now a blood brother, I proceeded to take the oath of loyalty, which contained a clause warning that divulging of any of the secrets of the organization was punishable by death. I was deeply impressed by all of this. The atmosphere of great secrecy appealed to my romantic sense. There were 2 degrees of membership. One was automatically conferred upon joining, and the second, which I took a few days later, involved the performance of some service for the organization. In my case, I recall, it was a trivial task, the selling of a dozen or so copies of its magazine, The Crusader. At the time that I had joined the African Blood Brotherhood, I knew little about the organization other than the fact that it was in some way associated with the Communist Party. I do remember having read a copy or two of The Crusader before I joined the group. Some of the history of the ABB I got from Otto from other members, but most of it I found out much later when I met and worked with Cyril P. Briggs, the founder of the group. The African Blood Brotherhood was founded in New York City in 1919 by a group of black radicals under the leadership of Briggs. A West Indian, as were most of its founders, he was the former editor of the Amsterdam News, a black New York newspaper. He quit in a disagreement policy over its owner, who attempted to censor his anti-war editorials. Briggs' own magazine, The Crusader, was established in 1919. The Brotherhood was organized around the magazine, with Briggs as its executive head, presiding over a supreme council. The group was originally conceived as the African Blood Brotherhood for the African Liberation and Redemption, and was later broadened to for immediate protection and ultimate liberation of Negroes everywhere. As it was a secret organization, it never sought broad membership. National headquarters were in New York. Its size never exceeded 3,000, but its influence was many times greater than this. The Crusader at one point claimed a circulation of 33,000. There was also the Crusader News Service, which was distributed to 200 black newspapers. Briggs, his associates, Richard B. Moore, Grace Campbell, and others, and the Crusader were among the vanguard forces for the new Negro movement, an ideological current which reflected the new mood of militancy and social awareness of young blacks in the post-war period. In New York, the new Negro movement also included the radical magazine The Messenger, edited by Chandler Owen and A. Philip Randolph, and The Emancipator, edited by W. A. Domingo. Many of the groups were members of the Socialist Party or close to it politically. They espoused economic radicalism, an oversimplified interpretation of Marxism, which nevertheless enabled them to see the economic and social roots of racial subjugation. Historically, theirs was the first serious attempt by blacks to adopt the Marxist worldview and the theory of class struggle to the problems of black Americans. With this broad grouping, however, there were many differences which emerged later. Briggs was definitely a revolutionary nationalist. That is, he saw the solution of the race problem in the establishment of an independent black nation-states in Africa, the Caribbean, and the U.S. In America, he felt this could be achieved only through the revolutionizing of the whole country. This meant he saw revolutionary white workers as allies. These were elements of the program which he perceived as an alternative to Garvey's plan of mass exodus. A self-governing black state on U.S. soil was a novel idea for which Briggs set up trivial balloons in the form of editorials in the Amsterdam News in 1917, of which he was then editor. Shortly after the entrance of the United States into World War I, he wrote an editorial entitled "Security for the Life of Poles and Serbs. Why not for colored Americans?" Briggs, however, had no definite idea for the location of this future colored autonomous state, suggesting at various times Washington, Idaho, Oregon, California, or Nevada. Later, after President Wilson had put forth his 14 points in January 1918, Briggs equated the plight of blacks in the United States to the nations occupied by Germany and demanded, "With what moral authority or justice can President Wilson demand that 8 million Belgians be freed when for his first entire term and to the present moment of his second term he has not lifted a finger for the justice and liberty for over 10 million colored people, a nation within a nation, a nationality oppressed and Jim Crowed, yet worthy as any other people of a square deal, or failing that, a separate political existence." He continued this theme in The Crusader. 1 year after the founding of the Brotherhood, Briggs shifted from the idea of a black state in U.S. soil to the advocacy of a black state in Africa, South America, or the Caribbean, where those blacks who wanted to could migrate. In this, he undoubtedly on the defensive, giving ground to the overwhelming Garvey deluge, then sweeping the national black community. In 1921, Briggs was to link the struggle for equal rights in the U.S. blacks with the establishment of a black state in Africa and elsewhere. Just as the Negro in the U.S. can never hope to win equal rights with his white neighbor until Africa is liberated and a strong Negro state or states erected on that continent, so too can we never liberate Africa unless and until the American section of the Negro race is made strong enough to play for the part of free Africa that the Irish in America now play for a free Ireland. The Brotherhood rejected Garvey's racial separatism. They knew that blacks needed allies and tied the struggle for equal rights to that of the progressive section of white labor. In the 1918 to 1919 elections, the Brotherhood supported the Socialist Party candidates. The Crusader and the ABB were ardent supporters of the Russian Revolution. They saw it as an opportunity for blacks to identify with a powerful international revolutionary movement. It enabled them to overcome the isolation inherent in their position as a minority people in the midst of a powerful and hostile white oppressor nation. Thus, the Crusader called for an alliance with the Bolsheviks against race prejudice. In 1921, the magazine made its clearest formulation, linking the struggles of blacks and other oppressed nations with socialism. The surest and quickest way, then, in our opinion, to achieve the salvation of the Negro is to combine the two most likely and feasible propositions: salvation for all Negroes through the establishment of a strong, stable, independent Negro state along the lines of our own race genius in Africa or elsewhere, and the salvation for all Negroes, as well as other oppressed people, through the establishment of a universal socialist cooperative commonwealth. The split in the world socialist movement as a result of the First World War led to the formation of the Third Communist International in 1919. The split reflected the new Negro movement as well. Randolph and Owens, the whole messenger crowd, remained with Social Democrats of the Section International, who were in opposition to the Bolshevik Revolution. Members of the Crusader groups, Briggs, Moore, and others, gravitated towards the Third International and eventually joined its American affiliate, the Communist Party, where they were followed in the next year or two by Otto Hall, Lovett, Fort Whiteman, and others. The decline of the African Blood Brotherhood in the early 20s and its eventual demise coincided with the growing participation of its leadership in the activities of the Communist Party. By 1923-24, the Brotherhood has ceased to exist as an autonomous, organized expression of the National Revolutionary trend. Its existing members became communist or close sympathizers, and its post served as one of the party's recruiting grounds for blacks. I first met Briggs upon my return from Russia in 1930. We were to strike up a lasting friendship, one that went beyond the comradeship of the party, and which extended over more than 3 decades until his death in 1967. Throughout those years, we were associated in numerous projects and found ourselves on the same side of many political issues. When I first met Briggs, he conformed to the impression that I had been given of him, a tall, impressive-looking man, so light in complexion that he was often mistaken for a white. He had a large head and bushy black eyebrows. He was a man possessed of great physical and moral courage, which I was to observe on many occasions. Briggs also had a fiery temper, which was usually controlled in the cases of comrades or friends. He had one outstanding physical defect. He was a heavy stutterer. He stuttered so much that it often took him several seconds to get out the first word of a sentence. When he took the floor at meetings, we would all listen attentively. No one would interrupt him because we knew he always had something important and pertinent to say. While he spoke, we would cast our eyes down and look away from him to avoid making him feel self-conscious, though he never seemed to be. We noticed that he stuttered less when he was angry. One such occasion was when Garvey rejected Briggs' offer of cooperation. The while Garvey saw through the maneuver for what it was, an attempt by Briggs to gain a position from which he could better attack him. Garvey lashed out at Briggs, calling him a white man trying to pass himself off as a Negro. Friends told me that this attack sent Briggs into such a rage that he mounted a soapbox at Harlem's 135th Street and Lenox Avenue and assailed Garvey for 2 hours without a stutter, branding him a charlatan and a fraud. Not only with this verbal lashing of his enemy, Briggs hauled Garvey into court on charges of defamation of character. He won the case, forcing Garvey to make a public apology and pay the fine of $1. Briggs' real forte, however, was as a keen polemicist, a veritable master of invective. His speech handicapped was a pity, because aside from the stutter, he had all the qualities of a good orator. Closely associated with Briggs was Richard B. Moore, a fine orator who did much of the public speaking for the ABB. What were the reasons for the decline of the ABB and its eventual absorption by the Communist Party? Why did Briggs fail to develop the program for black self-determination in the USA? In the 50s, I had a series of talks with Briggs and asked his opinion on these questions. His overall appraisal of the role of the Brotherhood was that it was a forerunner of the contemporary national revolutionary trend, and a very positive thing. Of course, we didn't stop Garvey, he said, but We were beginning to develop a revolutionary alternative. We put a crimp in his sails, Briggs added. For a while, the ABB had been a rallying center for left opposition to Garvey. Its memberships included a class-conscious black workers and revolutionary intellectuals who drew membership from both disillusioned Garveyists and radicals who never took to Garvey's program in the first place. The main reason for de-emphasizing the idea of black nationhood in the United States, Briggs stated, was the unfavorable relationship of forces then existing. Garvey, with his Back to Africa program, had preempted the leadership of the mass movement and corralled most of the militants. His hold over the masses was strengthened by the anti-black violence of the Red Summer of 1919. This gave further credence to Garvey's contention that the U.S. was a white man's country where blacks could never achieve equality. Indeed, for these masses, his program for a black state in Africa to which American blacks could migrate seemed far less utopian than the idea of a black state on U.S. soil. As for the South, Briggs did not feel such a region of entrenched racism could be projected realistically as a territorial focus of a black nationalist state. It would not have been so accepted by the masses who were in flight from the area. For himself, he reasoned, the very idea of self-determination in the United States presupposed the support of white revolutionaries. That meant revolutionary crisis in the country as a whole, and in that day no such prospect was on sight. In fact, white revolutionary forces were then weak and small, the target of vicious anti-red drives of the government and employers. In other words, he felt the black self-determination in the United States was an idea whose time had not yet come. The communists didn't have all the answers, and neither did we. Briggs indicated, whites as well as the number of black radicals undoubtedly underestimated the national element. Socialism alone was seen as the solution. Briggs was impressed, however, by the sincerity and revolutionary ardor of the communists and by the fact that they were a detachment of Lenin's Third Communist International. He felt that the future of the revolution in the United States and the black liberation lay in the multinational communist leadership. Though the ABB ceased to exist as an organized independent expression of the national revolutionary current, the tendency itself remained, awaiting for the further maturing of its main driving force, the black proletariat. By the end of the decade, the national revolutionary sentiment was to find expression in the program of the Communist Party. By the time I joined the Brotherhood's Chicago Post in the summer of 1922, the Crusader had dropped much of its original national revolutionary orientation. Although I was unaware of it, Briggs and the Supreme Council were presiding over the absorption of the organization into the Communist Party. In Chicago, the decline of the organization was slower than elsewhere. Perhaps this was because it had a strong base among black building tradesmen, plumbers, electricians, and bricklayers. Edward Doughty, a plumber by trade, was simultaneously the ABB post commander and a leader and founder of the American Consolidated Trades Council, the ACTC. The council was a federation of independent black unions and groups in the building trades industry who had formed their own unions for the double purpose of protecting black workers on the job and counteracting the discriminatory policies of the white AFL craft unions dominant in the field. Doughty, a tall, muscular man, was born in Mobile, Alabama, and had come north in 1912 at the age of 17. According to him, most of the black steam fitters and plumbers had learned their trades in the stockyards during the industrial boom and labor shortage that accompanied World War I. Some, however, had gotten their training at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Active in the Brotherhood along with Doughty were such outstanding leaders of the black worker struggle, such as Henry Dorsey, an electrician, and Alexander Dunlap, a plumber. Besides the tradesmen, other members of the ABB post included a number of older radicals, such as Alonzo Isabel, Norval Allen, Gordon Owens, H.V. Phillips, Otto Hall, and several others. Together with Doughty, they made up the communist core of the Brotherhood. My experiences in the ABB marked my first association with black communists. I met some of them before, at forums and lectures. I had heard Owens speak before the Bugs Club in the Dill Pickle forums, but I had never worked together with any of them before. They were mostly workers from the stockyards and other industries. One or two, like myself, were from the services trades. Like Otto, several of them had previously been in the Garvey movement. There was no doubt that they represented a politically advanced section of the black working class. They were the types who today would be called the political activists, the people who kept abreast of the issues in the South Side community and participated in the local struggles. I was interested to learn their backgrounds and how they had come to the revolutionary movement. I found that some of them had been among the Chicago's first Marxist-oriented black radicals and had been associated with the Free Thought Society. This society was formed immediately after the war and held regular forums. I believe its leader and founder was a young man named Tibbs. He was one of the earliest Chicago black radicals. A victim of police harassment and persecution, Tibbs was arrested during the Palmer raids in 1919 and spent several years in jail on a fake charge of stealing automobile tires. This continual persecution reduced his political effectiveness, which was as the authorities intended. Members of the Free Thought Society Forum, I learned, had cooperated with the new Negro movement of economic radicals centered around the radical weekly The Whip, edited by Joseph Bibb, A.C. McNeil, who later became the secretary of the Chicago NAACP, and William C. Linton. The members of this group, unlike their New York counterparts, were not avowed socialists. They were nevertheless influenced by socialist ideals and regarded the race problem as basically economic. In 1920, members of the Free Thought Society took an active part in the campaign of an independent, nonpartisan league, sponsored by the Whip and its editors. This coalition ran a full slate of candidates in the Republican Party of that year, in which they challenged the old guard Republicans of the Second Ward Republican organization as well as the so-called New People's Movement of Oscar de Priest. The election platform called for the abolition of all discrimination for public ownership of utilities, civil service reform, women's suffrage, children's welfare service, and organization of labor into one union. While they were not successful in turning back the Republican Old Guard, the campaign resulted in appreciable gains for some of the league's candidates. At the time, the main efforts of the ABB were directed at mobilizing community support for the black ACTC tradesmen. By retaining a secret character, its members participated as individuals in campaigns on local issues. They collaborated with the Trade Union Education League, the TUEL, of which Dottie was a member, in its drive to organize the stockyards. The TUEL supported the demands of the ACTC. At the time, it was led by William Z. Foster and Jack Johnstone. Later to become the Trade Union Unity League, it was a gathering of the revolutionary and progressive forces within the trade unions to fight against the reactionary labor bureaucracy and their collaborationist policies and Jim Crowism. Other members of the Brotherhood participated in the campaign against high rents that was waged in the South Side community. This was a fight in which a white party member, Bob Miner, and his wife, Lydia Gibson, played leading roles. I found my experience in the Brotherhood both stimulating and rewarding. In addition to learning a lot from the communists with whom I was associated, it was here I forged my first active association with black industrial workers. I found them literate, articulate, and class-conscious, a proud and defiant group which had been radicalized by the struggles against discriminatory practices of the unions and employers. They understood the meaning of solidarity and the need for militant organization to obtain their objectives. In this, they were quite different from the people of whom I had been associated with at the post office, as well as writers, whom I so commonly found to be stamped with a hustler mentality. Dottie and his followers in the trade councils were pioneers in the struggle for the rights of black workers, a struggle which has continued over half a century and remains unfinished to this day. The older tradesmen finally caught their way into the unions, the electricians in 1938, the plumbers in 1947. In the early 50s, Dottie became the first black officer in the plumbers union, but those gains were only token. The bars were still up against the blacks and other minority workers seeking jobs in the $90 billion a year industry. The Young Communist League. My sojourn in the African Blood Brotherhood was brief, about 6 months. I felt the need to move on. My original goal was the Communist Party. While I was in the ABB, the problem of white chauvinism in the South Side branch had been cleared up. Joining the party was no longer a problem. After all, the Brotherhood had been but a stopover. I was about to apply for admission when H.V. Phillips asked me to join the Young Workers' Communist League, the youth division of the Communist Party. Phillips, I learned, was a member of the district and national committees of the League. When I told him I was about to join the party, he said, "That's all right, but you're a young fellow and should be among the youth. Besides, more of us blacks are needed in the League." I thought the matter over. Why not? It's all the same. They're all communists. The next day Phillips took me to meet John Harvey, a white youth who was the district organizer of the League. Harvey told me that I had been highly recommended to them by Phillips and others. He expressed delight at my decision to join and said that it was a bit right in their plans since they were anxious to move forward with work among black youth, but were handicapped by the fact that they only had a few black members. I expressed my doubt that I could be considered a youth at the age of 25. They replied that there were a number of members in my age and older in the organization. All that was needed, they assured me, was that one was to have the youth angle. "What is that?" I asked. "Oh, that simply means the ability to understand youth and their problems and to be able to communicate with them." I was not sure I had all these qualities, but the proposition appealed to me, so I joined the YCL in the winter of 1923. The League at that time was a close-knit fraternity of idealistic and dedicated young people determined to build a new world for future generations. When we sang the Youth International at meetings, we actually felt ourselves to be, as the song proclaimed, the youth guardsmen of the proletariat. The organization was small, with only several hundred members. As I recall, Phillips and myself were the only blacks. I was still working on the Santa Fe and on layovers. I spent most of the time getting acquainted with my new comrades, attending classes, meetings, and social gatherings. I was impressed by what seemed to be a high level of political development and by their use of Marxist terminology. It made me keenly aware of my own sketchy knowledge of Marxism and the revolutionary movement and spurred me to close the gap. A partial explanation for their political sophistication, I felt, was the fact that a large number of them, perhaps a majority, were red diaper babies, their parents being old revolutionaries, either members of the party or its supporters. On the whole, they were a spirited, intellectual group, and as far as I could discern, exhibited not a trace of race prejudice. Many went on to become leaders of the party. There was our district organizer, John Harvey, a lanky youth who was one of the few WASPs. Max Chapman, a brilliant young orator and editor of the youth's theoretical organ, The Young Worker, who was later to become the first Trotskyist and then a rabid professional anti-communist. There was Valeria Meltz, a young, able leader, and her brother, their ethnic background was Russian-American, as was that of Jim Sklar Keller. His brothers, Gus and Boris, were old stalwarts in the Russian Federation and were well known. There was also Nat Kaplan, Ganley, and Gil Green. Gil was about 16 at the time. We used to call him the Kid. He went on to become the national chairman of the YCL and later a national leader in the party. I met a number of the League's national leaders. Johnny Williamson, a Scottish-American and national secretary. Herbert Sam Darcy, Matt Aburn, Phil Hubert, and many others, many of whom were to become national leaders of the party. There was no scarcity of places for meetings or for social affairs. We were on friendly terms with Jane Addams and her people at Hull House, where we sometimes met. Other times we used halls of various language groups. We participated in and supported the activities of the Anti-Imperialist League, headed by Manny Gomez, the party's Latin American specialist. The main campaign at the time was against the invasion of Nicaragua by the U.S. Marines. I was particularly impressed by Bob Mautz, a young Russian representative of the Young Communist International, the YCI, to the League. A small, dark-complexioned and softly spoken young man, Mautz hailed from Soviet Georgia. His mild manner belied his impressive background. Only 25 when I met him, he had fought in the Revolution and the Civil War, first as a Red partisan and then in the Red Army, which he advanced to the rank of colonel. He spoke what we call political English, and we were always amused by some of his expressions. For example, I remember how we used to kid Mounts about his being sweet on a certain girl comrade. She likes you very much, someone would say, but she's a little overawed by you. He replied very seriously, "How can I liquidate her suspicions of me?" He took a particular interest in me. I believe Phillips and I were the first blacks he had ever really known, and for us he was the first real Soviet communist we had ever met. I asked him questions about Russia, and told him I wanted to go there and see it for myself. "You undoubtedly will," he said in a matter-of-fact tone, as if the matter was settled. On one occasion he told me of the discussion he had on one eve of his departure from Russia. Zinoviev, then president of the Communist International, had asked him to look closely into the Afro-American question in the United States, and to see if he could find any confirmation for his belief, and that of other Russian leaders, that the right of self-determination was the appropriate slogan for black rebellion. Zinoviev added that he had long believed that the question would become the Achilles heel of American imperialism. I told Mounts that I liked the part about the Achilles heel, but I didn't feel that the slogan of self-determination was applicable for U.S. blacks. It was my understanding that the principle had to do with nations, and blacks were not a nation but a racial minority. To me, it smacked of Garvey's separatism. Mounts nevertheless raised the question of self-determination for discussion in a meeting of the Chicago District Committee of the YCL. Desirous of getting the committee's reaction to the question, he literally shouted down the white comrades. "Blacks are Americans," they said. "They want equality, not separation." Phillips and I, the only black members of the committee, were non-committal. And that was the end of that. They did not pursue the matter further. In order to move forward in the work with the black youth, we struck upon the idea of organizing an interracial youth forum on the South Side. The organizing committee consisted of Chi Dumping, a Chinese student at the University of Chicago, a young woman official of the colored YMCA, Phillips, a White League member, and myself. During this period, I was still working on the Santa Fe, but on my layovers I devoted all my time to the forum. We had rented a small hall, decorated it, and got it our publicity, leaflets, posters, and an ad in the Chicago Defender. Our first speaker was to be John Hardin, a black radical orator. It was our first effort at mass work among young blacks, and with our youthful enthusiasm we were certain of success, but the venture proved to be abortive. I can still remember our shock when we came to our meeting to find it wrecked. Furniture was smashed, posters ripped from the walls. There was no doubt in our minds that this was the work of police who had unleashed their stool pigeons against us. Some of our non-communist friends dropped out, and the project collapsed. The idea of a forum was abandoned. Temporarily, we hoped. A less ambitious plan was then agreed to. If we could enlarge our cadres by a few more blacks, we thought we could have a better base for which to appeal to mass work. It is therefore suggested that Phillips and I approach some of our acquaintances and try to recruit them directly into the league. I eliminated my waiter friends, all of whom were too old, and approached one of my former colleagues, a postal worker, who had been in our study circle and whom I considered a likely prospect. I remember that he sat very quietly while I delivered a long lecture on the league's program and activities, and the need to get support among the black youth. Finally interrupting me, he blurted out, "I'm sorry, Hall, but I find being black trouble enough, but to be black and red at the same time, well, that's just double trouble, and when you mix in whites, that's triple trouble." At first I was rather shocked by his offhand rebuff, considering it to be an expression of cynical opportunism. I felt that he had backslid even from his position at the post office, but he continued in a more serious tone. Apparently he felt a deep distrust for whites and their motives. He regarded the YCL as just another organization of white do-gooders, and saw me as their captive Negro. When I interrupted to say something about socialism, he cut me short. He said that he too was for socialism as a final solution, but that it was a long way off, and that he would not put it beyond the whites of the United States to distort socialism in a manner in which they could remain top dogs. In any case, he believed blacks would have to be on guard. In the meantime, he believed blacks should retain their own organizations under their own leadership. Alliances, yes, but we ourselves must decide the terms and conditions, he said. Our exchange had gotten off on the wrong foot. I was deeply challenged by his charge, and that I was a captive of the whites, and that the League was a white organization. For me, that meant that he felt that I was a white folks N-word, as I recall. I retorted by calling him a black racialist who saw everything in terms of black and white. Why not, he replied. Being a Negro, how else should I see things? After this flare-up, our tempers cooled off, and we continued our discussion in calmer tones. But I was definitely on the defensive, trying to explain why I was in the League, and why it was not an organization of white do-gooders, as he is charged. It was a revolutionary, interracial vanguard organization, I asserted. Sure, we only had a few blacks now, but our numbers would grow, I argued. He was still skeptical, and repeated that he was for socialism, but a special road towards this goal he felt was necessary for black Americans, under their own leadership and organization. Do you mean a black party? I queried. Why not, he rejoined. It might be necessary as a safeguard for our interests. I had no answers to his position. There was a logic to it which I hadn't thought about. We finally parted on friendly terms, promising to keep in touch. I left realizing that I'd come out the worst in our exchange. I felt that I had failed in my first effort to recruit a good black man to the League, and that we'd still had some study to do in regards to black nationalism. My friend had been, as I recalled, a bitter critic of Garvey, but I therefore assumed that he was hostile to black nationalism. But now it seemed that he had expressed some of Garvey's racial separatism. Thinking the matter over, I finally came to the conclusion that the main reason for my inability to counter his arguments was that I sensed that they contained a good measure of truth. What was most disturbing was the sense that his position was less isolated from the mass of blacks than was my own. Up to that point, I failed to understand the contradictory nature of black nationalism. I rejected it totally as a reactionary bourgeois philosophy which, in the conditions of the U.S., had found its logical expression in Garvey's Back to Africa program. It was therefore a diversion from the struggle for economic, social, and political equality, the true goal of blacks in the United States. The fight for equality, I felt, was revolutionary in that it was unattainable within the framework of the U.S. capitalist society. Nationalism, moreover, was divisive and played into the hands of reactionary racists. This, of course, did not exclude the acceptance of some of its features, such as race pride and self-reliance, which were not inconsistent with, but an essential element in the fight for equality. While rejecting nationalism, I also rejected the bourgeois assimilationist position of the NAACP and its associates, and their blind acceptance of white middle-class values and culture. What confused me were attempts to amalgamate what I felt were two mutually contradictory elements, socialism and class struggle on the one hand, and nationalism on the other. Or was the contradiction more apparent than real, I wondered. My friend's nationalism did not go to the point of advocacy for a separate black nation. He demanded only autonomy and in leadership and organization of the black freedom movement. Was this inconsistent with the concept of equality and class unity? Had not blacks the right to formulate their conditions for unity? For me, this was the first time I had encountered these questions. I attempted to reflect on my short experience in the YCL. Was there not a basis for black distrust of even white revolutionaries? The situation in the League was not as idyllic as I had first thought. There was a certain underestimation of the importance for the black struggle against discrimination and for equal rights among both the youth and the adults of the communist movement. Behind that, I sensed there was a feeling that the black struggle was not itself really revolutionary, but a sort of drag on the pure class struggle. There is no doubt the legacy of the old Socialist Party. Even such a revolutionary as Debs had said, "We have nothing special to offer the Negro. We cannot make separate appeals to the races. The Socialist Party is the party of the working class, regardless of color." And regarding the Afro-American question, social equality, forsooth, is pure fraud and serves to mask the real issue, which is not social equality, but economic freedom. The socialist platform is not a word in reference to social equality. Evidently, there were a number of theoretical matters still to be cleared up in the question of the struggle for black equality and freedom. I joined the party itself in the spring of 1925, recruited by Robert Minor, with the consent of the League. I'd quit the Santa Fe before the summer, and totally committed to the communist cause. I then decided to devote more of my time to the work, and to eventually become a professional revolutionary. I took extra jobs on weekends and worked banquets on an occasional extra trip on the road. I was living at home with my mother, father, and sister, who had an infant child, David. All were employed, with my mother accepting occasional catering jobs. Minor, who I had known for some time, was a reconstructed white Southerner from Texas, a direct descendant of Sam Houston, first governor of the Lone Star State. He was a former anarchist and one of the great political cartoonists of the day. His powerful cartoons were carried in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and later in the Old Masses, a cultural magazine of the left, and in the Daily Worker. Despite his many talents, he was a journalist of no small ability. Having traveled widely in Europe as a news correspondent during the First World War, Minor had visited Russia during the revolutionary period and had met and spoken with Lenin. With these impressive credentials, he was now a member of the party's Central Committee and responsible for its Negro work. This was understood as an interim assignment, eventually to be taken over by a black comrade as soon as one could be developed to fill the position. The person then being groomed for the job was Lovett Fort Whiteman, who was then in Russia taking a crash course in communist leadership. He had been an associate of Briggs on the Crusader, and also worked with Randolph and Owens on the Messenger. Later, as I recalled, his section was the cause for some disgruntlement among the black comrades. Why was Fort Whiteman chosen in preference to such well-known capable blacks as Richard B. Moore, Otto Weiswood, and Cyril P. Briggs, all of whom had revolutionary records of superior to Fort Whiteman's? At the time, there were no blacks on the Central Committee, and even when Fort Whiteman returned from Russia in 1925 to take charge of the Afro-American work, Minor remained responsible to the Central Committee. While not as flamboyant as Fort Whiteman, these black leaders had records comparable to, or better than, many of the whites on the Central Committee. Be that as it may, of all the white comrades, Minor was the best fitted for the assignment because of his wide knowledge and of close interest to the question. His intense hatred for his Southern racist background came through in some of the most powerful cartoons of the day. He had a wide acquaintances among black middle-class intellectuals. Bob and his wife Lydia had turned their side apartment into a virtual salon where blacks and white friends would get together to discuss the issues of the day. There I met various black notables, including Dean Pickens, National Field Secretary of the NAACP, and Abraham Harris, then Secretary of the Minneapolis Urban League. Harris would later become the chairman of the Economics Department of Howard University, and then a full professor of the same subject at the University of Chicago. The Fourth Convention of the CPUSA. It was the period immediately before the Fourth National Convention of the Communist Party. Factional fighting was at its height, with the party split between the two warring camps, the Ruthenberg Pepper Group versus the Foster-Bittleman Group. The atmosphere was rife with charges and countercharges of right opportunism and left sectarianism. This factionalism had spilled over into the League, which reflected the alignments then current within the party. I had stood aloof of these factions, as I did not clearly understand the issues. The question of blacks did not seem to be directly involved. I assumed it was a clash mainly between personalities and narrow group interests, and did not reflect political principles. Each side accused the other of responsibility for the farmer-labor fiasco, which left the party isolated in its first major attempt to form a united front. I could see no differences among the factions on the question of Bolshevization of the party. The Comintern had recently called upon the party to Bolshevize its ranks. Among other things, this called for a reorganization of the party on the basis of shop and street units, and the elimination of the foreign language clubs as federated organizations within the party. These clubs remained close to the party, however, and followed its leadership. I was inclined to favor the Ruthenberg Pepper Group because most of its party's Most of the party's black members, Dottie, Elizabeth Griffin, Alonzo, Isabel, Otto, and my sister Eppa, were in that group. This, I suspected, was partly due to the influence of Bob Miner and Lydia Gibson, their work on the South Side in the tenant struggle of 1924, the support of Dottie's Consolidated Trades Council, and their consistent advocacy in the party of the importance of work among blacks. Most of this occurred after I had left the APB and joined the YCL. Upon joining the party, I immediately became part of the Ruthenberg group. Under Miner's tutelage, I was to undergo intensive indoctrination. According to the Ruthenberg faction, Foster, Biddleman, Jack Johnstone, and their allies, Cannon, Dunn, and Schachtman, were opportunists, narrow-minded trade unionists lacking in Marxist theory, and hence in the ability to lead a Marxist party. They said that Foster's group, which possessed a majority of the delegates, was out to steamroll the convention and tossed Ruthenberg, Pepper, and Lovestone out of the party. For most of us, the clincher was that Foster group lacked the confidence of the Communist International. This later change, it seemed to me, was confirmed by the decisions of the Fourth Party convention the following summer. I was a delegate to this convention from the YCL. I was to witness the intervention of the CI in the person of its on-the-spot representative, Comrade Green, Gusev, an old Bolshevik friend and co-worker of Lenin and Stalin. For obvious security reasons, only the leaders of both factions had direct contact with him. His job was to suppress factionalism and unite the party on the basis of the Comintern line. I must say that he tackled his task with an expertise that was remarkable to behold. First, he set up what was called a parity committee, composed of an equal number of the top leaders of both factions. He himself as a neutral chairman. Since the two factions were evenly represented on the committee, his was the deciding vote. I remember that there was the widespread speculation among the delegates as to which faction he would support. We didn't have to wait long. The convention had been in session for about a week. The atmosphere was charged, passions inflamed, a split seemed imminent. Indeed, our caucus leaders had difficulty in preventing a walkout by some of the more hot-headed members. A message had finally arrived in the form of a cable from the CI, which undoubtedly was sent at Gusev's urging. The cable was presented to the Parity Committee by Gusev. It demanded that under no circumstances should Foster's majority be allowed to suppress the Ruthenberg group, because, it went on to say, the Ruthenberg group is more loyal to the decisions of the Communist International and stands closest to its views. As the majority or strong minority in most districts, and Foster group uses excessive mechanical and ultra-factional methods. It further demanded that the Ruthenberg group get not less than 40% of the Central Executive Committee, as insisted as an ultimatum to the majority that the Ruthenberg retains post of secretary, categorically insisted upon Lovestone's Central Executive Committee membership, demand a retention by Ruthenberg group of co-editorship on Central Organ. The result was greeted with great jubilation by our group. Foster refused to accept the majority of the incoming Central Committee under these circumstances, in which his loyalty was questioned, and ceded leadership to the Ruthenberg group. The result was that the Ruthenberg-Pepper group retained key positions on the new Central Committee, Ruthenberg as General Secretary, Lovestone as Organizational Secretary, Bedacht as Agitprop Head. Despite factionalism, the convention marked a step forward in work among blacks. Although the decision threw no new light on the question, the platform adopted did contain the most elaborate statement the party had thus far made. It subscribed to full equality in the relationship between black and white workers. It advocated the right to vote, abolition of Jim Crowism in law and custom, including segregation and intermarriage laws. The main thrust of the program, however, was directed towards building black and white labor unity on the job and in the union. Toward this, the platform asserted that our party must work among the unorganized Negro workers, destroying whatever prejudice may exist against trade unions, which has been cultivated by white capitalists, and the Negro petty bourgeoisie. Our party must make itself the most foremost spokesman for the real abolition of all discrimination as of the as largely unorganized Negro workers in the same union with the white workers on the same basis of equality of membership, equality of right to employment in all branches of work, and equality of pay. The party had called for the inclusion of black workers in existing unions. It came out against radical separatism and dual unionism, but it declared its intention to organize blacks into separate unions wherever they were barred from existing organizations, and to use the separation as a battering ram against black exclusion. Emphasizing the relationship between these partial demands and ultimate goals, the platform declared that the accomplishment of the above aims was not an end in itself, and that, on the contrary, it was the struggle for their accomplishment that was even more important. In the course of the struggle with such demands, we will demonstrate that these aspirations can be realized only as a result of the successful class struggle against capitalism, and with the establishment of the rule of the working class in the Soviet form. It must be remembered by that at this time the attempts to infiltrate the Garvey movement had proven unsuccessful, and that the African Blood Brotherhood, the sole revolutionary black organization in the field, had been dissolved. To meet the need for an organizational vehicle to put our program into effect, the party and the Trade Union Education League sponsored the American Negro Labor Congress, ANLC. In the meantime, Levitt Fort Whiteman, our man in Moscow, had returned to head up the Negro work and to prepare the launching of the ANLC. H.B. Phillips, Edwards, Dottie, and I were assigned to the organizing committee for the Congress, drafting and circulating the call, and approaching organizations for delegates. As I remember, most of the blacks in the party were assigned to work on the Congress. Otto's was not involved in the activities, as immediately after the Fourth Party Convention, he had left for Moscow with the first batch of black students. Fort Whiteman was a truly fantastic figure. A brown-skinned man of medium height, Fort Whiteman's high cheekbones gave him somewhat of an oriental look. He had affected a Russian style of dress, spotting a rubolchka, a man's long-belted shirt, which came almost to his knees, ornamental belt, high boots, and a fur hat. He was a veritable black Cossack, who could be seen sauntering among the streets of South-Side Chicago. Fort Whiteman was a graduate of Tuskegee and, as I understood, had had some training as an actor. He had been a drama critic for The Messenger and The Crusader. There is no doubt that he was a showman. He always seemed to be acting out a part he had chosen for himself. Upon his return from the Soviet Union, he held a number of press conferences in which he delineated plans for the American Negro Labor Congress, and as a black communist fresh from Russia, he made good news copy. Fort Whiteman had taken responsibility for lining the entertainment for the opening night of the Congress. Characteristically, with his Russian affections, he arranged for a program of Russian ballet and theater. The rest of us didn't question what he was doing, and the incongruity of the program didn't occur to us until the opening night. The meeting took place on Hall on Indiana Avenue near 31st Street, in the midst of the Black Ghetto. When I arrived, it was packed, perhaps 500 people or so. Inside, I was suddenly attracted to the commotion by the door. As a member of the steering committee, I walked over to see what the matter. Something was amiss with the Russian ballet, which was about to enter the hall. A young blonde woman in the ballet had been shocked by the complexion of most of the audience, which had apparently expected to be of another hue. Loudly, in a broad Texan accent, she exclaimed, "I am not going to dance for these N-words." Somebody shouted, "Throw the cracker bitches out," and the Russian dance group hurriedly left the hall. The Russian actors remained to perform a one-act Pushkin play. They, at least, were genuine Russians from the Russian Federation. But alas, it was in Russian. Of itself, the play was undoubtedly interesting, but its relevance to a black workers' congress, was, to say at least, unclear. Although Pushkin was a black man, he wrote as a Russian, and the characters portrayed were Russian. More significantly, however, and perhaps an indication of our sectarian approach, there was the fact that no black artists appeared on the program. Fort Whiteman made the keynote speech outlining the purpose and task of the Congress. He was a passable orator and received a good response. Otto Haywood, an associate of Briggs, was one of the first blacks to join the party, also spoke. Richard B. Moore brought the House down with an impassioned speech which reached its peroration in Claude McKay's poem, If We Must Die. I was spellbound by Moore. I'd never heard such an oratory. That night, Phillips and I left the hall in high spirits. In fact, I was literally walking on air. At last, I felt we were about to get somewhere in our work among blacks. Phillips, a bit more sober than I, remarked, "Let's wait and see the reports of the Credentials Committee." His caution was justified, for the big letdown came the following morning. The first working session of the Congress convened with about 40 black and white delegates, mainly communist and close sympathizers. The crowd of 500 at the opening night rally had been mainly community people. I think it was Phillips who remarked that there had hardly been a face in the working session that he didn't recognize. Most participants, sadly, were from the Chicago area. The organizing committee had prepared a draft resolutions for the Congress to consider. As we anticipated a much larger turnout, we made plans for a Credentials Committee, Resolutions Committee, etc. But in light of the small attendance, these resolutions and preparations took an Alice in Wonderland quality. For example, according to the Constitution, the group's purpose was to unify the efforts of the organization of Negro workers and farmers, as well as the organizations composed of both Negro and white workers and farmers. Despite our efforts and work, the ANLC never got off the ground. Few local units were formed. Resolutions and plans were never carried into action. Only its official paper, the Negro Champion, subsidized by the party, continued for several years. Among the postmortems undertaken by on the organization was one made by James Ford in the book The Negro and the Democratic Front. He commented that for a period of its existence, the ANLC was almost completely isolated from the base masses of the Negro people. Disappointment and the disillusionment followed, and the personal differences surfaced among our group. A fact that the Congress had failed, and with it, our first efforts to build a left-led united front among blacks. There was a natural tendency to find scapegoats for the failure. Moore and Haywood were the able delegates from New York, seemed to have come to Chicago with a chip on their shoulders. They made no attempt to hide their contempt for Fort Whiteman, whom they had known in New York. They openly alluded to him as Miner's Man Friday. At the time, I was shocked at what I felt like the attempt to malign these comrades. This was especially true of Bob Miner, whom I regarded with respect and affection. He was sort of a father figure to me. Fort Whiteman, on the other hand, was still an unknown quantity. My feelings about him were rather mixed. I was both repelled and fascinated by the excessive flamboyance of the man. But much later I recalled overhearing a conversation between him and Miner during the preparations for the Congress. Miner informed Whiteman that Ben Fletcher, the well-known black IWW leader, had expressed a desire to participate in the Congress. It was evidence that Bob was pleased by the response of such an important black labor leader. Fletcher, as an IWW organizer, had played a leading role in the successful organization of Philadelphia longshoremen. His attendance would undoubtedly had attracted other blacks to the labor movement. Fort Whiteman, however, vehemently opposed the idea and exclaimed, "I don't want to work with him. I know him. He's the kind of fellow who will take over the whole show." That ended the discussion. Fletcher was not invited. I didn't know Fletcher at the time, but as I reflected back on the incident some time later, it was clear to me that had he been allowed to participate, Fort Whiteman would have been overshadowed. I was too new to pass judgment on Fort Whiteman's qualifications, but I did wonder why he was chosen over such stalwarts as Moore and Haywood. Haywood, as the delegate to the 4th Congress of the Comintern in 1922, was the first black American to attend the Congress of that body. Claude McKay was also a special fraternal delegate to that Congress. Together with other delegates, Haywood visited Lenin and became the first black man to meet the great Bolshevik. He became the first black to serve as a candidate member on the executive committee of the Communist International. On the whole, I was very optimistic during my early years in the party, confident that we were building the kind of party that would eventually triumph over capitalism. End of Chapter 4. Thank you all for listening to this episode of the Book Club Commune. next episode, we're going to be getting into Chapter 5, which is called A Student in Moscow, where Haywood will visit the Soviet Union. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to share this with your comrades and anyone else who you think needs to hear Black Bolshevik in any form. That is the goal of this, is just purely to get the word out there. I know that this book is hard to find copies of, and I could not find any audiobooks for it, which is the entire purpose of me doing this. So if you know anyone who has been trying to read Black Bolshevik or struggles to read it without an audiobook form, please share this with them. I know this isn't great. I know that the audio quality is utter dog shit, but it's better than nothing. Speaking of audio quality, I am looking for a way to get a better microphone to record this, because currently I am just recording this on my phone. So I don't know what type of microphone to get. Nothing expensive because I am poor. If you have any suggestions for a cheap, good quality microphone that I could get, please hit me up on my Twitter. That is at red_commune_. Just to let me know where I can start looking for an actual mic. I'm going to buy that myself, because I will never take money for this. I hope you all have enjoyed this episode, and solidarity, and keep on reading.